Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to today's webinar and overview of ISO20400 for sustainable procurement. I am Marisol. I am the category manager responsible procurement at LUPC. Today we have James Cadman, lead consultant Action Sustainability, who will provide an overview of the ISO20400 standard and how organizations of any size can deliver sustainable outcomes through their supply chains. Next, we will have Neil Powell, Environmental Manager at NHS Blood Transplant, one of LUPC's members, who will share their experience of going through the ISO20400 assessment. We will finish with a Q&A session. Delegates can use the Q&A function in the menu at the bottom of the screen to ask any question throughout the presentations, and we will be answering them at the end of both presentations. So welcome, everyone. And I'll hand over to James to start the presentation.
Okay, so thank you for the invite. I'm here today to talk to you about the ISO 2400 standard and sustainable procurement more widely, and kind of the work that we have been involved with LUPC and NHP. So as I say, my name is James Cadman. I work for a small environmental sustainability consultancy called Action Sustainability. We're notionally based in London, but that's becoming less relevant in recent months. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the standard. It is an ISO standard, it's international, but let's take a step back first of all. This is about sustainability, and I'm sure many of you know this, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we're talking about all of sustainability, not just environment, not just social, not just economic. It's all three pillars, the traditional three pillars of sustainability. So it can be the environmental impacts of products and services you buy in terms of carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, waste, water and air quality. It could be the social impacts, particularly with the Social Value Act of the products and services we buy in terms of equality and diversity and inclusion, human rights and labour standards, but also the economic side of things about supply chain resilience, about working with small and local businesses as well. So it's all three together, and it's how we embed that within the procurement and the supply chain management that we deliver. So what are the various names for this? There's many names for what we call sustainable procurement, depending on who you speak to and which websites you go to. Lots of variations on the same thing, and you can see several of them coming up on the screen now. But for us, it's sustainable procurement, and it's sustainable because it covers all three pillars that I just mentioned. It's not just environment, it's not just social, and it's procurement because it's not just about buying. Buying is very much at the sharp end of doing the transaction. So we are getting into a bit of nomenclature here, whereas procurement is the whole process. It's looking at your category management plans, it's looking at your supplier relationship management. It's the whole piece, and as you'll see in a minute, it goes up and down the whole organisation. It's not just about the people who are placing the orders and doing the purchase. So the evolution of sustainable procurement. I'm sure many of you have heard of the flexible framework and you might still use it. That is probably the very beginning of where sustainable procurement as we see it today in the UK comes from. But this is a kind of a very crude picture to describe the evolution of how sustainable procurement has evolved and is still evolving. It's not a finished journey by any means. The start, the guy on the right hand side needs to close, nothing else. But some of you might remember Procuring the Future and the Sustainable Procurement Task Force, 14, 15 years ago, and out of that came the Flexible Framework, a one-page document that was a maturity matrix to understand the progress that an organisation has in delivering sustainable procurement. And it covered people, training, policy, supplier engagement, measurements, those kinds of good things. That is still there, that is right at the heart of, the core of what has become the ISO standard, but it has changed in many, many ways. In between that, we had a British standard, 8903, about 10 years ago, and that got some good traction, but because it was a British standard, it was slightly hampered by that label in terms of it going more global. And then about 6-7 years ago, the ISO committee suggested that we needed an international standard, and effectively the British standard was used as a template. If any of you know BS 8903, you'll know ISO 2400. Much of it is the same, although it's just been developed out for a more international market and taking different situations into account in different parts of the world. A key example of that is we were working with Brazilian colleagues very closely. One of the key things that they're working around is the economic side of sustainability and corruption and bribery. That's a real big issue for them at the moment. Clearly, there's a lot of environmental issues as well with the Amazon rainforest, but in terms of tackling it through procurement, that was their focus at the time of developing the standard, rather than some of the other, social or environmental issues that we might be dealing with more closely here in the UK. So the standard itself, ISO 2400, and that's just, again, that's how most people call it, 2400, which is a bit confusing because you might think it's written 2400, it's actually 20400. It's a framework guidance standard, and that's a key point to note. You can't get accredited to it. You can't get a nice shiny certificate in the way that you would for 9001 or 14001. It's a guidance standard, a bit like ISO 26000 on CSR, if any of you have come across that. So it's a framework. It's meant to help you through that journey of becoming more sustainable in your procurement. You can't pass or fail it. You can't have an auditor come in and give you a stamp. You can get an assessment, and that's what Neil will be talking about a bit later, to give a kind of objective third-party view on how closely aligned you are to the standard. But as I say, if someone tries to sell you something that says you've passed and you are accredited to, tell them to go away. On the right-hand side, you'll see a diagram which summarises the standard in 4 key areas, and we'll come to those in a minute in some more detail, but it breaks it down. The idea is it takes it right from the top of why should an organisation be doing sustainable procurement? What is the point? Through your policy and strategy, which should make sense, the enablers function, which I'll explain a bit more later, and then into the procurement process itself, how you actually go about buying things in a sustainable fashion. The documents on the left are the standards themselves. There's also a free to download guide from IEMA, about 20 pages, which gives an overview of the standard, what it's about, what the benefits are, why you should be using it, without getting into the detail of the criteria that you'd get in the standard. Importantly, the standard makes a definition for sustainable procurement. And as you'd expect from what I've just been saying earlier, that it's the most positive environmental, social and economic outcomes on a whole life basis. It really is holistic across sustainability, across the life cycle of a product or a service or project, and looking at whole life costing and all these kinds of aspects to it. It really is inclusive. So, some sustainable procurement myths and barriers. Some people think that sustainable procurement is more expensive. It can be if you do it incorrectly, but if you do it properly, you should be saving money. You should be consuming less stuff, using less energy, being more respectful of your workforce. You should, in the long term, on a whole life basis, be saving money. It's often been accused of being less transparent, potentially, but if it's done properly, it is a way of being more open and clear with your supply chain, with your stakeholders, with your clients as to what you're doing and why you're doing it. What are the benefits of doing this? Some people have accused it of being irrelevant. Well, that's false. It is definitely something that's there as a mechanism to make sure you buy what you need, and it's for the purpose that you want it to be, taking sustainability. Again, the accusation that it means that you can only buy local is false. It's about the right product or the right service for what you need, taking sustainability into account. Of course, there's the OG regulations, notwithstanding what will happen in 2021 after the EU exit. But outside of that kind of constraint of you can't stipulate local, it's talking about social value that you can build in, which is often where some of the local stuff comes in. It makes tendering more difficult. If anything, it should make it easier because it's giving suppliers the opportunity to shout about the sustainability benefits of their products and services. If the tender is written well and it is focused on that product and the sustainability impact of that product or service, the supplier will be able to respond, and they'll be able to understand what it is that you're asking for, and therefore come back with a suitable response to talk about the energy efficiency or how many apprentices they're able to hire to meet your need. And likewise about small businesses and SMEs, if it is focused in and done well, and it's not a blanket one-size-fits-all approach, and you focus in on what you're trying to get out of your tendering process, SMEs can join in. There's no reason why they can't. And the final accusation is something about distorting competition. If anything, this is going to help competition because it's going to encourage and stimulate competition around sustainability as a driver, an economic driver for those suppliers to get involved, get engaged, because they'll have those products that can meet your needs on a sustainability basis, and they can help you drive your sustainability targets and KPIs. So what's changed during the evolution? We're moving to a place where we're taking into account client requirements on a more tailored process, We're collaborating more. There's a bit more of an open sharing of best practice. So yes, there's still competition at the heart of it when you're going for a tender, but in terms of what good practice is from a sustainability point of view, there's a lot more sharing of that, of how we can move to a more sustainable situation. And the supply chain competence is rising because of that. One of the things that Action Sustainability delivers is the Supply Chain Sustainability School. It's aimed at the built environment, construction, facilities management, and so on. But that's all about raising the sustainability competence of suppliers so they can meet the client's needs. And so it's taken outside of the competitive situation and providing them with the learning and knowledge and skills that they can deliver on client needs around local spend, reduced waste, reduced air quality, whatever the key drivers are. And importantly, the final point I want to mention on here is about measurement. There's kind of no point doing a lot of this unless you understand how much you're improving the situation, and therefore you need measurement of baselines and targets and so on. That has been driven a lot more with the standard that we have. So in summary, this is what has changed. We're not having a one-size-fits-all blanket questionnaire that goes out and covers every environmental impact and every social impact. It's a prioritised approach. I'll get onto that a bit more in a second. It's focusing on the supply, so the product and service that you buy, which does tie in with OG regulations, rather than the supplier themselves. So what of the supplier might have ISO 14001, and that's great, but that doesn't help you with the product you're buying. There is some nuance in this. If you're thinking about carbon, for example, and you're wanting to buy a product that's got as low carbon emissions as possible, you should be thinking about the embodied carbon of how that product was manufactured. That then might play back into, well, how does the supplier, the manufacturer, get their energy to manufacture that product for you? Do they have renewable energy? So there is an element of supplier in there as well. Moving away from auditing, and so due diligence is definitely needed, particularly when you have extended supply chains, but it's not relying on audits. It's using that as one of many tools that you can bring into the situation to understand where your risks are, where your hotspots are, and what you need to do about them. Education has got as big a role to play in that as well. And then I've mentioned the performance management, the measurement piece as well, having real-time performance management rather than coming and looking back at a previous 12 months retrospectively and saying, well, we did okay, but the opportunity is being missed to do anything about it. So why the focus on supply chains? This diagram for me sums it up pretty neatly in one picture. Picture says 1,000 words in terms of where supply chain sustainability impacts lie. And you can, if you tilt your head to the left, you can see the different categories of different sectors and industries out there. And as you work to the left and you get into more of those product-based sectors, you'll see that supply chain impacts account for 80% of all the impacts. That's all the embodied energy, water, materials that go into manufacturing those products, particularly down at the food and beverage end, telecoms, technology and so on. A lot of it is embedded into the supply chain already. Even with something like chemicals and some of the utilities, there's still a huge impact from the supply chain. So having that understanding, that awareness that where your biggest impacts lie is really going to help you. You know, there's a few mantras here that getting your own house in order first is important, and I totally agree. Look at your own impacts, but then look outside your own four walls. And this kind of diagram explains why that's beneficial to do, because you might think that you've reduced all your impacts, but then you look up your supply chain, you think, crikey, there's a lot of impacts there from all the stuff that we buy, we use, either as a service or as a direct product. And this diagram is also useful. It's talking about supply chain disruption, and particularly with recent times and supply chain resilience, particularly in healthcare. We've been doing a lot of work with various category towns in the NHS lately about provision of materials and products. Disruptions happen, and obviously COVID has been a very stark, very important situation with that. But in previous times, there's been other triggers to disrupt supply chain, and it does affect not only continuity of delivery of service, but also if there are shareholders, stakeholders, and their view and impact on it. So there's several that come to mind. The Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan, when there was a tidal surge, it knocked out lots of industrial capacity, and lots of supply chains were negatively impacted because of that. There were massive floods in Thailand a few years ago, which took out some IT manufacturing plant, and they were one of only one or two plant in the world that manufactured that particular component. So it was eggs in one basket time, basically. So it's understanding where your supply chain is and how diverse it is, and therefore what your risk is to supply chain security, resilience, and what the knock-on effect is to delivering your business. The standard thinks about that. The standard thinks about that supply chain continuity through the economic pillar of sustainability. So the standard itself, it's a guidance standard that says you can't, as I say, you can't get accredited to it. You can get evaluations, but you can't get a certificate as such. It talks about what sustainable procurement is, the different considerations that you need to think about. You look across your whole organization from policy and leadership direction all the way down to actually doing the buying, and how to implement it practically. It's a very user-friendly manual. It's more of a manual. It's a hands-on guidance standard rather than the usual language that you might read from ISO 9001 for quality. And importantly, because it's global, it applies to any organization in any sector of any size. It has to be agnostic of those, otherwise it's not applicable internationally. So whether you're public sector, private sector, NGO, whether you're small, medium or large, whatever country or countries you work in, irrelevant. It applies to everyone. And importantly, this doesn't replace legislation or policy or anything else. It's there as a supporting document to help you deliver on procurement. So this is how the standard looks. You have all the usual stuff at the beginning about scope and normative references and definitions, but the four key sections are fundamentals, policy and strategy, organization, which is sometimes called enablers, and process. And they cover different aspects, which I'll get into. So you can see that the fundamentals is all about the high level piece. What are you trying to set up? What is the direction for your organization? The policy is how you're going to deliver that. What are your aims? What are your objectives? What's your strategy over the next few years to achieving that? What are the targets that go with that? The organization, which we call in English enablers, and there's a point there about different languages not having the word enabler within them and what that actually means. It's about how do you set the system up so that it works? Have people got the right training and competence? Is there the right governance and document framework to drive it? Have you engaged with all your stakeholders, both internally, your fellow departments, and externally with your clients, your suppliers, your regulators, trade bodies, anyone who's a stakeholder? Do you understand your priorities? What are the key things you need to go for? What are those things that you buy that represent the biggest risk to you or the biggest opportunity? And for what sustainability impacts? Is it around carbon? Is it around material resource use, such as rare earth metals in terms of lithium batteries, for example? What are the big hotspots for you that you should be focusing on? It's the 80-20 rule. Don't go after every nut and bolt. You should be going for the big stuff. And then the reporting I've mentioned, there's clearly a piece in there about measurement and tracking what you're doing. And importantly, there's also this thing called a grievance mechanism that's come in. This came in from the Japanese delegation, about giving the supply chain a route to discussing a grievance. If they've noticed something within their own organization and they don't feel that they can go to their own leadership team to say, labour standards aren't great, we're not being paid the right wages, we're polluting the local river course, whatever the issue might be, is there a route for them to raise that concern to one of their customers or their customers' customers? Is there a route to that? Many organizations do that through a third party, an NGO, who provide that kind of helpline, hotline service to raise those concerns. It primarily came out of labour standard issues, but again, it's all a sustainability. It could be anything within that. And then last but not least, the process itself. It is the standard procurement process. We're not trying to change it. The standard isn't about changing or telling people how to go and buy stuff. It's telling people how you can weave sustainability into that and make it part of that process alongside cost, quality, delivery, maintenance, and so on. The standard is separated out into those sections, and depending on where you sit in an organization, there's various bits that are relevant to you more than others. I mean, by all means, read all of it. It is a relatively easy read for a standard. But if you're, in the senior management team, you understand what your fundamentals and your policy are. What's the direction for the organisation? Whereas if you're actually doing the buying and the sourcing activities, you're going to be more interested in the process. So it's been deliberately signposted depending on the kind of role that you might have. So yes, the fundamentals. Why are you doing this? What is sustainability, and what does it mean to your organisation? In the green circle, what is your policy? How are you going to deliver it? The enablers, I've just given you some good description of, and then the procurement process. It's, as I said before, it's everything from your SRM to your different systems, how you do a market assessment for products, and it's weaving sustainability into that. It's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it's taking what you've got and expanding it more sustainability. So one example in the fundamentals is something called the drivers. What are the reasons why an organisation is being sustainable with its supply chain? And the standard gives 13 topics that you might want to look at, and have an internal process and engage with clients as well. Why are you being sustainable? What is driving you to be sustainable? Because that will help shape your policy and your strategy and your approach to doing sustainable. Is it around customer demand? Is it about cost reduction? Is it risk in the supply chain? So there's some kind of very reactive side of things. But then there's the proactive side, like your workers, your staff and your colleagues are demanding it. Your recruitment is demanding it for new intake. You're looking for more innovation. It's a way to get supply commitment and become more of a closer relationship with your suppliers rather than just a transaction. You might have personal leadership. So Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, he's very much on the platform all the time talking about sustainability. So some key figures out there. The different reasons for doing it, and going through this thought process with senior management and staff and colleagues can really get you to understand, well, that's why we're doing it, that's what we need to focus on, and also think about the future. Where can we go with this? What should we develop further and evolve? Policy and strategy, we all have policies. It's about including sustainability in your procurement policy. Some organisations have a separate standalone sustainable procurement policy that talks about green issues. Others eventually get to a place where they just merge it into one, so they have one procurement policy which happens to have sustainability in it, and that's the place where we would recommend most organisations get to, so that you're not singling sustainability out for any special treatment. It's just embedded, it's part of the DNA alongside quality, cost, and supplier engagement. So there's many standards out there, many policies out there, some of which we helped write ourselves and others that other people have done. The idea being that it's a simple document that is easy to digest, both internally and for suppliers and contractors to understand, and customers to understand where you're going and why you're doing these things, and to very simply explain what you've recognised as being your key sustainability risks and opportunities. And then describing what you're going to do about them, what your objectives are, how you're going to mitigate and reduce your impact. So it's a bit of a glossy on one level, but it's a very functional document as well to summarise what you're doing. On the enablers piece, as I say, this is in the standard. It's called organisation, or changing the organisation to make. It's a very long sentence. I can't remember it. It's the enablers. It's the engine room. It makes things work. As I said, it's about enabling people, giving them the right training and competence, engaging with your stakeholders and so on. The one I just want to go on to is setting priorities. So this is an example of a RAG rating risk assessment for a tier 1 construction contractor. And down the left-hand side, you'll have their key categories of spend. And across the top, you have their key sustainability impacts. And they've broken it out into environmental impacts, healthy communities, which is more of the social sustainability pillar, but also the profitable markets, which is their business bit, their economics bit. And what they've simply done is RAG rate it. And like any RAG rating system, red is a warning beacon to say that's a potential risk or an opportunity to focus on. Amber is we're not too sure, it needs a bit more investigation, or it might be a risk. And green is obviously something that is a lower risk. Within that, you can focus on thinking about, is it a large risk inherently, as in the scale and magnitude of it is big? Do we spend a lot on that product or not? And has it got a big carbon impact or big social impact, for example? And then you also need to think about what leverage do you have with the supply chain? Because you might say, well, yes, there's a big impact, but we have no choice. We have to use that product. There's only one supplier. So can we do anything about it? Potentially not. So that red risk might become an amber. So it means that you would look at it and say, yes, we need to do something about it and diversify our supply chain. But at the moment, there is only one supplier, we have to go with it. So you need to think about different aspects. And then on the spend categories, you can break it down into subcategories and down into individual products, or even down to individual suppliers if you wish. So there's a good process to go through, and it really helps focus what you should be discussing with suppliers, rather than that blanket approach I talked about earlier that used to be the norm. And suppliers will respond to that because they'll recognise that those are the key sustainability issues, and they'll be able to respond coherently rather than some kind of nebulous answer that sometimes suppliers come back with. And it means that you get a more useful response that you can take forward. So it's a very simple approach, but it's very effective in terms of driving good sustainability outcomes that are then measurable later on, the other part of enablers. Part of that, one of the things that the document, the standard, talks about is really about considering as an organisation, but also at a category level, where you sit on this 2x2 matrix. What influence do you have in the marketplace? Can you influence the supply chain to move to a more sustainable situation? So you're on the right-hand end. So if you're a Dyson, for example, you'd probably be on that right-hand end because they can influence the marketplace when it comes to hand dryers and vacuum cleaners and so on. But there's very few people like that. So are you at that end or not? And then in terms of your ambition for sustainability on the y-axis, are you very ambitious? Have you got high objectives and targets to become more sustainable, or is it less so? So you can think about where you are in that, and that can influence as well your ambition for sustainability and how far you go in your engagement with suppliers. And the procurement process. I just wanted to give a couple of examples how organisations have built sustainability into the procurement process. This is from National Grid. Obviously, they provide all the electricity to everyone in the UK pretty much. And you can see it on the screen. They embedded carbon, into their tendering process. 5% weighting, which is fairly good. And that's for people who are, for suppliers who are coming on site and constructing a facility and asset for National Grid. And they're very much clearly saying that if they can design a lower carbon solution, they stand a better chance of winning work. It's very clear. It's very enticing to suppliers to engage on that. So it's embedding it right in to what the procurement process for National Grid is. It's very clear to the suppliers. They can respond to it. They understand it. It hits National Grid's targets around embodied carbon and reducing their scope 3 emissions through concrete, steel, and various other things that get built. And it drives a real effect. So this is one outcome from that. New substation built in Wimbledon, southwest London. Thinking about a smarter design, a leaner design, using less stuff, using lower carbon materials. And you can see the stats. They generated 20% reduction in carbon, about 39,000 tonnes, and a financial saving as well. So it's very clear that there's a financial and a carbon benefit. And this can be applied to different sustainability impacts, different products and services. It's just thinking and engaging with the suppliers on what they can do to help. Very briefly, whole life costing. I'm sure many of you are aware of whole life costing and life cycle costs. The standard gives some good description about the different levels of whole life costing, whether it's total cost of ownership or life cycle costs, and externality costs as well, and thinking about those as much as possible. I don't think any organisation can jump straight to all life cycle costs, but over time you can develop that. So, it's not just upfront price, of course. It's the running and the maintenance of the product or the service as well, and then thinking about disposal costs and then any other costs that come after that. But that can be developed over time. Very briefly, some observations that we've gathered over recent times. To make this work, this is the enablers piece here, this one, is about getting sustainability built into people's job descriptions at a basic level and their objectives and targets. Otherwise, they're going to be less encouraged or less incentivized to deliver sustainability as well as the rest of their job. There's still a long way to go. Many organizations are doing some good stuff, but it's pulling it all together and identifying where sustainability is happening already and then transferring that to other parts of the business. And then it's about the whole business. It's anyone who has an influence on a purchase. So it's not just the procurement team. It's not just the sustainability team. It's the estates team. It's HR in terms of recruitment and objectives and people's job descriptions. it's the ICT team who might specify what they want for their computer systems. They might not go and do the buying, but they're doing the specification. So anyone who has that influence on procurement, and most people will at some point, they are involved as a stakeholder to a greater or lesser extent. But it's not just purely the role of the procurement managers and the sustainability managers. There's a wider bunch of stakeholders engaged. And for us, it's smart procurement. It's thinking more smartly. It's not just sustainable procurement. It's using all the assets you have available to you to get the best outcome you can, sustainably, but also financially. And I think this is pretty much my final slide. Just to give an example of some of the organizations we've worked with in the past on their sustainable procurement, ISO20400 particularly, a variety of organizations across different sectors, different sizes. So you can see there's rail companies in there, there's utilities, there's public sector bodies, there's manufacturing companies, there's transport, delivery, power companies, just to demonstrate that the standard is applicable to organizations of different sectors. In terms of sizes, UCOS, bottom left-hand corner, they're a tiny stationary company. SSE are a massive power and energy supplier, as are NG, for example. So different sizes, different sectors. I'm going to skip that slide and go to the end. So that's me. I'm happy to take any questions at the suitable point. So shall I hand back to Marisol?
Thanks, James. We will have now Neil from NHS Blood Transplant, and after that we will answer some of the questions. If you have any question, please just put them in the Q&A section at the bottom, and after Neil we will answer all of them.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Neil Powell. I'm the environmental manager for an organisation called NHS Blood Transplant. Our key objective as an organisation is saving and improving patients' lives. And I'll come back to how that fits in with why we decided on ISO 2400 and some of the things we're doing around the standard. Within our organisation, it's identified that we've only got really two key resources. One is our staff, so attracting and retaining the best staff in their fields. And two is our donors, whether that's the donors who give blood or the donors' families who allow us to receive or pass on organs and tissues from their families members, deceased family members, to recipients. There are two assets. We haven't really got any other assets apart from those two groups. We hold ISO 14001 standard, and that's great from an environmental management point of view. However, what we found is it concentrates, or it drives thinking towards systems, procedures, and outputs, if you like. So we're dealing with things at the as a process and at the end of life, if you like. So we're dealing with waste, we're dealing with energy emissions rather than energy procurement. We're dealing with potential for pollution. So it's all dealt with at an output stage. When we looked at our 2015-2025 strategy for sustainability, which has sustainable procurement as a key objective, it didn't seem to fit. It didn't seem to drive improvement in that area. So what we decided on was looking at ISO 2400 as a method to attach to our 14001 system to drive those improvements in procurement, which has worked really well. I've got a bit of a mantra, which is if you put something in place and it doesn't challenge in terms of risk management, then you're probably not doing the right thing. But ISO 2400 has given us some real challenges. It's made us really think about our supply chain. One of the key things for us is that we've found is not an issue, it's something we need to concentrate on, is mapping that supply chain. So understanding where our supply chains link to, and the full supply chains and the risks within those. So we have like many people will have, or many organisations, quite a big supply chain, lots of different suppliers. They've got lots of suppliers, lots of operations that go back into the Far East and into developing countries where labour standards might not be as good. So what that's, so as I say, 2400 has allowed us to start thinking about is which are the key contracts that we're going to concentrate on. We can't concentrate on everything. So we're starting to look at, it's helped to start to identify those high risk areas and start to develop into those and try and work out what we're doing and how we're going to manage the risks that are in those supply chains. As I said at the beginning, that link to people, we're a people organisation. The 2400 standard has made us start to think about the other people outside our organisation and donors. So we want to treat our staff well. We want to really look after our donors and patients. And what it's starting to make us do is think about, yeah, we're doing that great for the people here in the UK, but are those standards? Are we living those values in the wider world for our supply chain? And yeah, that's the key. As I say, the key for us is that we've got that thinking, that drive to think about the impacts that we're not just having from an environmental point of view, but those wider corporate social responsibility issues that we want to be the best at in our field. Currently, we've been assessed now in 2018. The beginning of 2018 and the end of 2019, and our scoring is moving up slowly. Where we will gauge success. The scoring is from 1 to 5. You get an assessment of 1 to 5. As James said, you don't get a certificate, the shiny certificate you can put on the wall, but you get an assessment. We're gauging success within the current strategy at a score of above 4. And we're looking to be reassessed again in about 12 months' time. Yeah, it's, as I said, it's a good accompaniment to a 14001 system, because again it bolts on all those other things that 14001 doesn't really look at or isn't good at looking at, which is that human aspect to corporate social responsibility and environmental management. And I think that's it from me. And I'll hand back to Marisol. I think we've got some questions and answers coming up now. Well, thank you for listening to us, and I'll hand over now.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, we have a couple of questions, similar questions, and I think maybe Neil can help a bit more with that one, because it's with the ISO 14001. So my question is, if you have a mature approach through ISO 14001, how does 2400 fit into the picture when they have different scopes? And the other one similar is how have you integrated the 14001 aspects register and action plan with 2400 risk assessment and actions, or have you kept them separate? So I think you're mute.
Steps off of mute. Yep. I'll deal with the first question. Yeah, we have a relatively mature 14001 system. The way that we've used 2400, the language is slightly different. So if you look at the 14001, look at 2400, and not one is a certifiable standard. So there's certain things in there that are pass fail. 2400 doesn't have that. But the way we've used it is an add-on to 14001. Again, as I said, to look at those corporate social responsibility aspects. 14001 for us and for myself doesn't really deal with. It's more about looking after the environment, looking at the end of pipe issues, if you like. So 2400, we've bolted them on nicely. One of the things that does drive that is our strategy. So the strategy itself has some environmental objectives, so 50% reduction in carbon, zero waste to landfill, but it also has sustainability, sustainable procurement aspects in there. So that's where we use 2400. We use 2400 as a tool within our 14001 system. And the other question around about risk assessments and actions, yeah, we've fully integrated 2400 within our 14001. So our aspects register includes sustainable procurement issues, so especially around construction, and our needs and expectations of interested parties, which is part of the 2015 14001 standard. 2400 allows us to address a lot of that. So it allows us to address the needs and expectations of our donors, staff side, our unions, our staff, the public in general, and governmental. So yeah, we use it, we keep them. 14,001 is our headline, 2400 is what we use as a tool within that, I think is the answer.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The word that comes to my mind is that they dovetail together, that 14,001 is largely around your organisation focused on environment. And it's almost like you get to the end of 14,001, it's like ... what's next? Oh, the supply chain. So you move on over to 2400 in a simple approach.
Thank you. Is a 2400 a good tool to encourage suppliers to own their emissions and clearly define who owns which part of a scope 3 emissions?
I'm happy to pick up on that one. So this comes back to the risk assessment and heat mapping. If you've identified and working, in engagement with your suppliers, that they have a lot of carbon in what they do, either the products or the services or the transport or whatever they do, that's your scope 3 carbon emissions. It's going to be their scope 1 and 2 to some extent, but your scope 3. If you've identified that, the risk heat mapping, the red, amber, green, should highlight that. And then you should be engaging with them through the tendering process, but also through the supplier relationship management piece around how they can reduce their scope 3. So then you might come out of ISO 2400 and flip into a carbon reduction strategy with your suppliers around a particular product or particular service that they provide you. But 2400 is the tool to identify that and bring that into procurement and that supplier relationship management approach. It'd be remiss to say, well, why are we focusing on, I don't know, water consumption if they don't consume any water, for example. So National Grid is a great example that, yes, they will use water, but very, very little. Carbon is the big thing for them. So that's how they've identified it and brought it through.
Thank you. Regarding the heat mapping example, at what level will you perform this assessment, e.g. specific to individual contractors or at the commodity level?
Whatever works for you. It really can be done at any level. When we've done this with clients, we start off at the level that I showed you, where you've got maybe something that's manageable, basically, something you can get your head around, and it's the 80-20 rule. So you'd start off at a higher commodity level and think about those key areas, and then as you get more proficient at it and people get more used to using it as a tool, you can then dig down into subcategories. And if you've got a category that's really high impact, really red, you probably want to get down to the suppliers as well, because then you can look at them and say, well, some suppliers are doing pretty well, but others aren't. And how can we transfer that knowledge, or how can we pick our suppliers based on that? We'll keep these three, but these three need some support to develop in some shape or form. So it's whatever level works for you, but I'd recommend starting at the higher level with your main category spend areas before you get down into the detail. I'd also recommend getting lots of internal stakeholders involved. It's not just one person sat in a darkened room colouring in red, amber, green on their own. It needs to be a consensus approach across the procurement team, sustainability input, and some of those other stakeholders I talked about earlier, because then you get an organisational approach and an organisational agreement on what you're going to focus on.
Do you want me to pick the next question up, Marisol?
Yes. Please suggest the best way to get procurement and S&T buy-in to embed 2400.
Yeah, the methodology we used, given my risk management background, is we used it as a risk. We talked about risk to the SMT and risk to procurement. So as I said, my organisation, we have this moral link, if you like, between the donor who's altruistically giving blood or tissues and the patient who is in need of blood or tissues, or blood products and tissues, so to say. So the risk that we have as an organisation is interrupting that moral link between those two parties. So the way we went to our SMTs and our board was to say we have an objective to be sustainable. That's what our donors want. We have and our staff want. We have an objective to have a sustainable procurement. So the reason for 2400 is for us to be able to provide a governance and assurance framework, if you like, that we can then challenge ourselves with and to be able to give the board that sort of assurance that they're looking for. So it's easy to say we're going to have a sustainable supply chain. The next question is, what does that mean? What does that look like? And 2400 gives you a framework for what that will look like and how to manage it. So that's, selling it. I sold it to our board, our SMT, on that risk management approach.
And just to build on that, is in the I showed you that spider diagram with the drivers exercise. You know, if we were doing that for your organisation, you'd say organisational ethics is going to be 10 out of 10. As you say, it's that moral link. And then stakeholder expectations as well. That'd be pretty high up in my view, to say stakeholders are saying, well, if you say you've got this altruistic agreement between donor and recipient patient, that you'd expect it to be as that would be taken into account just inherently in what you do. So that kind of approach, working with senior management, can help them realise or bring out what they know already, but frame it in terms of sustainable procurement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions. Someone said fantastic presentation, so thank you, Neil and James. Someone's asking for the definition of sustainable procurement back on the screen.
I will put it in the I'll put it in the chat box to everyone. I'll copy and paste it in the chat box.
Thank you. I think we've done. Thank you so much, Neil, James. Thank you to all the attendees. Hopefully you find useful the presentation.